August 11th, and missiles are flying at the Crimean Bridge.
This is fucked, gentlemen.
Hello? Unbelievable. The bridge has been blown up. The bridge has been blown up. Boom, boom, pop. Whoa. A new special operation by the SBU. Strikes on the bridge, the Black Sea Fleet, and Crimea's air defense. And something terrible began in Crimea. A new wave of explosions on the Tarkankut Peninsula, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki District, Bakhchisarai District, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions.
Just now, out of the 12 incoming missiles that were heading directly toward the critical bridges, what you are seeing right now on your screen is the strategically important Chongar Bridge.
The Security Service of Ukraine is launching a new phase of the special operation, attacking the Crimean Bridge, military facilities, airfields, and military bases. Panic and evacuation have begun in Crimea.
We've been standing here since 4:25 in the morning. We've been here for about 5 hours already, and at 6 they turned us around and sent everyone home to rest.
We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitin right now. There it goes again. Look.
Oil depot.
Oil depot.
This is the end, gentlemen.
A new wave of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki District, Bakhchisarai District, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. There is an evacuation in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad, the headquarters of the Northern Fleet in Severomorsk, nuclear submarines, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge is damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, and specifically strategic ones, because, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them, as it turned out, 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the Ukrainian one. At least one confirmed Tu-95 was hit at the Ukrainian airfield. So strategic aviation, and after that, a strategic bridge. The bridge truly has strategic significance because it connects the Russian Taman with our peninsula, Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed, in principle, until we liberate Crimea, or, for example, until it becomes possible to approach with bombers and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. The only way is through engineering methods to destroy it, that is, blowing up all the pillars. In other words, you have to lay charges, but there will be a lot of problems just to deactivate it from its active state at the very least. But simply damaging it at the moment, as was done previously by the security service, and disabling it in 2022 and 2023 for a certain period of time, at least for half a year, say, during the summer campaign, is actually possible. Moreover, a significant and strategically important strike specifically on the Kerch Bridge is intrinsically tied to the very beginning of our comprehensive liberation campaign to decisively deoccupy the entire Crimean Peninsula, a territory of immense historical and geopolitical significance. Why? Because it is absolutely necessary to first destroy this bridge, or damage it, or put it out of commission. There are different ways to do this in order to prevent the Russians from transferring enough troops to Crimea. After that, using long-range strike capabilities, whether drones or missiles, since it's only 200 or 300 kilometers to Crimea. We have the capability, almost all of our systems can reach that distance. In other words, that's the main range for our long-range operational level strike systems, which are also operated by the security service. Therefore, I think the next wave will be a strike specifically targeting military facilities in Crimea, of which there are currently at least 100 stationary ones in operation and about 100 mobile ones. So the intelligence services have a vast amount of so-called work ahead of them, but this can already be considered a strike on the Kerch Bridge. This is the beginning of the liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard a comment from Keith Kellogg. He is simply stunned. He believes this is simply a huge, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. That Ukraine struck at the nuclear triad of the Russian Federation at 2 components, right? This is the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course, the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And the fact that you feel the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU special operation.
Well, that means there will be a third one as well. If, for example, a Russian submarine gets hit, I wouldn't be surprised whether it's in the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet, because they feel far too comfortable in the sea. And we've already struck both Russian ground positions and strategic positions, but there's still one component left, the so-called naval component. That's why in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet, and then went quiet somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that yet another Russian submarine might sink. And Putin, as always, will say, well, what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? Well, it broke down into quarks. So this too, maybe we should wait. There's probably still a third serious blow ahead. And this is the first one. You're right to point out the triad. You're emphasizing it correctly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. It was precisely the strategic bombers, Russia's strategic nuclear armament, that Maluk's strike demonstrated, showing that this component no longer dominates the world unambiguously. Why? Because, well, a $500 drone or a sufficient number of drones can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. This is possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that we are now in the era of drones, the era of drones. It feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into a kind of planet Shelyazyaka. No water, no vegetation, no minerals, inhabited by robots. In other words, inhabited by these kinds of drones. And in the end, this apocalypse could, of course, actually come to life, the one that was once shown in Hollywood movies. So this significant problem really does exist in virtually all the countries of the entire world that have heavily invested in robust strategic security mechanisms and comprehensive defense systems. Well, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over the past 100 years in something that, in the end, a $500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds? And that's exactly what Malyuk demonstrated. So I would put it this way. Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the driving force at the forefront of a new era of security using different mechanisms. The real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, sophisticated drones that with remarkably minimal funding can effectively accomplish truly major and significant tasks. Basically, all these current strategies will eventually be rendered completely obsolete. Once, if anyone vividly remembers Rakin, may he rest in eternal peace, he had a truly great and memorable monologue. Where are those six-story fools, the dinosaurs? Where did they go extinct? But the little bug, it's been living and thriving for 30 billion, or was it 3 billion years? So the next era will be something like this. In other words, the little bugs we're talking about now, the small drones, they'll keep getting smaller and smaller, but without losing their combat power. And in the end, what will they come to? To the point that Putin recently predicted, together with Skabiva and all that Russian media riffraff. Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing about combat mosquitoes. Believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes invade Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, I won't even mention it, not a single Russian will be left there. They'll be drawn to them by the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, it's unbelievable. No filter can help there, not a single one. You have to put on gas masks if there are Russian federal troops nearby. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd, all those Russian federalists who invaded Ukraine.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away and we've already carried out missions there. Olenia is not far from the base. So this direction is basically possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. But as for Vladivostok, on the one hand, that's even easier. We've discussed before, what is Vladivostok really? Well, it's the Green Wedge. It's the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians. Genetically, for over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka there? Well, for example, I know this from the airfields. Chernihivka and also Ukrainka, these are ours. These are our people from Poltava. Poltava natives and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots make themselves known. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of this green wedge of ours, our Ukrainian one. Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge, all the more so if, in the end, we recognize the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, then it could even, for example, sign agreements with, say, with Japan itself regarding the return of those same disputed islands. Disputed, but they're Japanese islands, and even Sakhalin is a Japanese island. So this issue needs to be addressed there in parallel, of course, putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think there aren't any of our midshipmen there? Practically every other one there is Ukrainian, our own solid genetic lineage among the midshipmen, because back in the day, all the warrant officers in the Soviet army were Ukrainians, and all the midshipmen in the fleet were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if the task is set, survival of our nation, then this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink practically the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach relations with the Japanese and South Koreans the right way, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Grigorievich, when I spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And for example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars also a realistic goal for the special services, Ukrainian ones, of course?
Well, that's rather complicated, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, strategic forces, missile forces. That means there is a certain selection process for service. There are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there is very strict control over this particular component. And it would be very difficult, for example, to get close enough to destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. You see, they're all butterfingers anyway. They'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent, excellent missile. It was first launched, I think, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And then the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main basic, so to speak, fundamental starting conditions were, of course, still set in the Soviet Union. They had a good school there, especially the rocket school, especially after our Ukrainian practically put everything into the rocket program. If you remember, that is, while Khrushchev was the general secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, he accomplished this task, and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both of them were Ukrainians. That's why the rocket program was, of course, very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up on certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up scattered across different republics, things changed. By the way, the main ones are here with us, specifically in Ukraine, because we built the same SS-18, the same Satan missile. It was us who made it at Yuzmash. Naturally, the Topol is a successor of this kind of missile program, especially the Topol M. It's quite a good missile. The next one after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but it's basically the same kind of missile, just with a different warhead, one with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. That's the Yars. So after the Topol comes the Yars, then the RS-24, and then the RS-26. They built or tried to build the Oreshnik, also known as the Rubesh. That's the Rubesh. Putin called it Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. Well, the Sarmat can't even get off the launch pad. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. And most likely this whole series of missiles has been written off. So they basically won't have the Sarmat, and with the Oreshnik, they'll keep fussing over it like a fool with a sieve. But once its informational impact wears off, they'll forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world as well, the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers intercontinentally. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on both the Topol and the Yars. The Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, each with its own guidance, about 6 warheads that are deployed. So this is truly a serious problem. But it's probably not as much of a problem for us because, well, these are nuclear weapons, and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And as for firing a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at themselves, well, that's like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So this isn't a problem for us, it's a problem for NATO generals and for the Chinese as well. In other words, these are long-range destruction mechanisms. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders. the Iskander KN-23s, and also the Kinzhal missiles, that is both ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, which need to be neutralized. But the optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on something: diesel, gasoline, and they fly on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon sector needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector. That's why this problem exists, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have set up serious production of these missiles by now, but they still haven't appeared. Well, we hope that in the end, we will get them, our own ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. Because first of all, we need to destroy all Russian oil refineries and everything related to fuel production. And secondly, of course, air defense. That is, we need to increase the number of anti-ballistic systems like the Patriot SMT. There is no third option.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation. Then they blew up the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. And essentially, that's where the enemy's groupings are sustained. How do you assess the situation right now? Last night there were explosions, and today explosions continue in Crimea. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, they packed Crimea like sardines in a can with several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something grand there. In other words, they increased the number of Russian livestock in Crimea. Naturally, they've also stuffed it with military facilities for almost 11, well, it's practically the 12th year now. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed it, well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked too far ahead, so far in fact that in the end they lost Crimea in the first place, initially allowing the loss of Crimea back in 2014. So a large number of Russian civilian invaders, they are indeed civilian invaders. None of the conventions apply to them, but they don't know this. Any Russian who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that protect civilians apply to them. That is, naturally, for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in principle is not that difficult, specifically in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is a closed area, squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron, a strategically vital and naturally enclosed area with only two primary entry and exit points, specifically from Taman via the impressive Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors, which are crucial connections linking it directly to the mainland of Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it goes toward Melitopol, passing through Henichesk. Those are the branches leading there. That's why, for us, when it comes to liberating Ukraine, it's important to start by liberating Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself if you compare, for example, the ratio of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbas. You need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is simply asking to be the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms for this. How can this be done? Well, first of all, of course, we need to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to Russia. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there: a railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system, the entire Kerch Bridge system. And without question, all 5 of these bridges need to be destroyed in this regard. The second bridge, the one next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks, and of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge, generally speaking, is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships, which can be used as ferries between ports, for example, from the Russian Black Sea coast to our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry with serious tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted, and basically the air bridge can be cut off. And the main thing, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches of both highways and railways running through there. So, of course, those can be targeted as well, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Mius, and then across the Kalmius bridges. But realistically, for us, it's very close, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And basically, that's probably what we'll do. That's why these strikes, which happened simultaneously on both the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely targeting the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First cut off the supply systems and then hit them with long-range strike assets, which everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then surely we can find 500 drones for Crimea at least once a week. The main thing now is to retarget our efforts specifically toward this component. And the milestone for the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets. They will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, we need to use drones and missiles to strike military targets in Crimea, and only then, starting next spring, or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. But that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of aviation units to provide support specifically for the ground operation. And of course, we'll be relentlessly targeting Crimea from all sides.
All in all, the summer of 2025 in Crimea promises to be a hot one.
Absolutely. And Russians really need to remember, as we discussed with you back in 2023, they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control, so Russians will have to swim freestyle breaststroke or dog paddle their way out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those routes simply won't exist.
Run, racists, get out of Crimea. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU's special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I will continue discussing the SBU's Operation Web. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, stated US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's agility and determination. He said these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli train operation as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
The Americans weren't shocked because we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. In other words, there was a very specific protection of strategic strike assets, specifically because of these important treaties. Moreover, one of the main and crucial conditions was that these planes had to be readily accessible for comprehensive monitoring by external surveillance systems such as advanced satellites. So it turns out that both the Russian and the American military forces are absolutely required to park their respective aircraft in designated areas that are clearly visible to the opposing side, ensuring transparency and mutual observation. But we're not adversaries. No one told Malyuk that. He hasn't read that New START treaty. Naturally, he went ahead and struck the Russian strategic forces, taking out one target. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen to their bases. And their bases are wide open, no one's even touched them. Honestly, if the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out the American strategic forces, they could do it too. And if they get serious about it, especially the Chinese will get involved. We can see that the Chinese have really surged ahead of everyone else in this regard. So that's their problem. They weren't shocked by our so-called audacity. They were stunned by their own vulnerability to these kinds of weapons, like drones, even a simple dirt-cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich. Today I read a brilliant analysis by a Ukrainian woman on Facebook, a patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus or other missiles that could have allowed us to destroy this entire nuclear triad, is simply shocked and frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
That's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it this way, a person that is someone closely connected to military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century, in the previous century, is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century. No one now remembers the atlatl or the boomerang, though I mean the actual boomerang, not the missile. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now, that is, in the last century, when rockets appeared, when airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is that same Navy that used to consume trillions of dollars. I mean, just think how much had to be invested, trillions of dollars. And here, it turns out, with his decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, Malyuk has basically crossed out this almost century-long saga of, to put it bluntly, looting the most powerful military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service has basically given the finger to this entire strategic triad, no matter what form it takes. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad doesn't scare us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead that explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just some serious conventional missile. You can only measure it with a radiometer. The radiance from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is an explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you scatter spent nuclear fuel rods over Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. He'd be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square if the Russians used nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet about the nuclear topic now? Because they realize very well that it was no accident they poked a hole in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who truly knows what might unexpectedly land upon Grandpa Lenin there? Perhaps a peculiar third head will suddenly grow, and he'll then enthusiastically run around proclaiming, "You are indeed on the absolutely correct path, my dear comrades." Well, roughly wherever it's pointed to.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information: that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we've destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't an information operation, and it could very well be a Russian information operation, since they sometimes leak events like this into the information flow through certain dubious channels. And then if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative, then they show this Kobylash, yes, and will go on to say that we are not quite the right kind of people in how we handle this. So for now, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, we are holding off. Although, strictly speaking, from the standpoint of responsibility, well, Kobylash should have been made to fly. As for who, so to speak, will make him fly or has made him or will make him, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about responsibility, it was specifically Kobyliash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then he'll have to fly later. Well, how else could it be?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect. The well-known analyst Roman Zvitan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much as always. See you soon later this week.
Goodbye.